Oprah Winfrey brings her TV show to Forsyth County, Georgia, a place where no black person has lived for 75 years. She sits in front of 500 angry white people, gives them the microphone, and asks one question: why? What happens next becomes the most controversial, courageous, and watched episode in TV history. This is the story of the day Oprah walked into America's most racist town, and refused to leave until they answered. January 1987, Cumming, Georgia. Oprah Winfrey steps off a bus in Forsyth County and the air feels different here, heavier somehow, like the weight of 75 years of absence pressing down on her shoulders, and she knows, everyone knows, that this town hasn't had a single black resident since 1912 when night riders came through with torches and guns and drove every black family out, killing some, terrorizing the rest, creating a place where whiteness became law not through legislation but through violence so complete that 3 generations grew up never seeing a black neighbor, never sitting next to a black classmate, never questioning why their entire county was a monument to ethnic cleansing disguised as a southern town. She's here to do a television show, a live broadcast in front of 500 residents, most of whom didn't want her to come, many of whom are gathering now with signs that say, "Keep Forsyth White" and "Oprah Go Home," and she can see them through the window of the community center, white faces filled with anger and fear and something else she recognizes from years of interviewing people, that particular mixture of shame and defiance that comes from knowing you're wrong but refusing to admit it. Because admitting it would mean confronting everything your parents taught you, everything your town stands for, everything you've accepted as normal your entire life. The producers are nervous, the crew is nervous, even her security team is nervous because this isn't a studio in Chicago with controlled audiences and screened questions, this is live television in a town that has spent 75 years making sure people who look like Oprah don't exist here, and now but Oprah isn't nervous, or if she is, she's channeling it into something else: anger, determination, the bone-deep conviction that America needs to see this, needs to watch what happens when you put a mirror in front of racism and refuse to look away, needs to understand that places like Forsyth County aren't aberrations or relics of the distant past but living, breathing examples of how hate gets passed down like family recipes, taught to children who grow into adults who teach their own children until the whole town becomes a machine for perpetuating absence. She walks toward the stage, and the story of what happens next will change television forever. The year is 1987, and Oprah Winfrey is 33 years old, already famous for her talk show that's been beating Phil Donahue in the ratings, already known for her ability to get people to open up on camera, to tell truths they wouldn't tell their therapists, but nothing in her career has prepared her for Forsyth County because this isn't about getting someone to cry over a breakup or confess a family secret. This is about confronting a town's collective decision to erase an entire race of people and then act like it never happened. The backstory is simple and brutal. In 1912, a white woman named May Crow was allegedly assaulted, and before any trial or investigation could happen, a mob formed, and within days 3 black men were lynched, and then the night riders came, organized groups of white men who went from house to house telling black families they had 24 hours to leave or die, and most left, abandoning homes and businesses and churches, taking only what they could carry, and a few who stayed were found dead in the woods, and by the end of September 1912, Forsyth County had 0 black residents, and it stayed that way for 75 years. 3 generations grew up in a place where blackness simply didn't exist except as a threat, a warning, a story parents told to justify the absence. They had to leave because there was trouble, as if the trouble wasn't white people with guns, as if exodus was a choice rather than survival, as if the empty spaces where black families used to live weren't crime scenes that nobody bothered to investigate because the criminals were your neighbors and your sheriff and your mayor. And then, in January 1987, civil rights activists organized a Brotherhood March through Forsyth County to protest the all-white demographics, and thousands of marchers came, and thousands of counter-protesters showed up waving Confederate flags and throwing rocks and bottles, and the whole thing turned into national news, and that's when Oprah decided to bring her show there, to sit down with the residents and now she's here, walking onto a stage in the Cumming Community Center, and the audience is packed, 500 people, almost all white, many of them hostile, some curious, a few genuinely wanting to understand why the rest of America is suddenly paying attention to their quiet town, and Oprah sits down in a simple chair with no desk to hide behind, no distance between her and the crowd. And she looks out at faces that range from suspicious to angry to defensive, and she says, simply and directly, I want to understand, why don't you want black people living here? The silence that follows is the kind of silence that happens when people realize they're about to say out loud things they've only said in private, when the comfortable bubble of agreement that exists in an all-white town is about to pop because there's a national television camera pointed at them and millions of people watching, and they can't just nod along anymore. They have to actually defend the indefensible or admit it's indefensible, and neither option feels good. A man stands up, middle-aged, wearing a plaid shirt, the kind of guy who looks like every dad in every small southern town, and he says, "We just want to preserve our way of life," and Oprah asks, "What way of life?" Another woman stands, older, her voice shaking with emotion, and she says, "I'm not racist, but I don't want my children going to school with," and she stops, catches herself, rephrases, "I just think people are happier with their own kind," and Oprah leans forward and asks, "Who told you that? Who decided what your own kind means?" And the woman doesn't have an answer because nobody ever asked her to justify it before. It was just accepted, just true, just the way things were, and now this black woman on national television is asking her to explain why she thinks separation is natural when it was actually violently enforced, and the cognitive dissonance is written all over her face. Then a younger man stands up, maybe in his 20s, and his anger is less disguised, more raw, and he says, "This is our town, we built it, and we have a right to decide who lives here," and before Oprah can respond, a black activist in the audience, one of the marchers from the Brotherhood March, stands up and says, "You built it on land you stole after you murdered and terrorized the people who were here first," and the room erupts. White audience members shouting, a few people trying to leave. Producers wondering if they should cut to commercial, but Oprah doesn't flinch, doesn't back down. She sits there in the center of the chaos and waits for it to die down because this mess, this anger, this confrontation, is exactly what she came here to show America. The show continues for 2 hours, and what unfolds is unlike anything television has shown before because Oprah isn't narrating from a safe distance, isn't doing a documentary where white people's racism gets softened by sympathetic music and historical context. She's sitting right there, a black woman in a room full of people who have spent their entire lives in a place designed to exclude her. And she's giving them the microphone and letting them speak their truths, and those truths are ugly. And uncomfortable and necessary because America needs to see this, needs to understand that racism isn't just KKK rallies and lynchings, it's also ordinary people in ordinary towns making ordinary decisions to keep their schools and neighborhoods and churches all white, and those ordinary decisions add up to segregation just as complete as anything Bull Connor ever enforced with dogs and fire hoses. One moment stands out above all the others. A man in his 60s stands up, and unlike the others who hedge and use euphemisms, he just says it plainly, "I don't want N-words living next to me," and he uses the actual word, the full word, on live television, and the audience gasps, and Oprah's face doesn't change, doesn't register. She lets the word hang in the air for a moment, lets America sit with it, and then she asks him, "Why?" And he says, "Because that's how I was raised," and she asks, "And you never questioned it?" And he says, "No, why would I?" And she says, "Because maybe what you were raised to believe is wrong," and it's such a simple statement, almost gentle, but it cuts through everything because she's not attacking him, not calling him evil, just suggesting that he might have inherited hate the same way. He inherited his father's farm and never thought to examine it, and for a second, just a second, you can see something flicker across his face, not agreement exactly, but maybe the first tiny crack in a lifetime of certainty. Other residents stand up to defend their town, to insist they're good people, not racist, just want to preserve their community, and each time Oprah asks a version of the same question, "But why does preserving your community require keeping black people out?" And nobody has a good answer because there is no good answer, there's only the circular logic of prejudice. We keep black people out because we don't want them here, and we don't want them here because we've kept them out so long that their presence feels like an invasion rather than a return. Near the end of the show, a young white woman stands up, early 20s, clearly uncomfortable with everything she's hearing, and she says, "I've lived here my whole life and I never thought about why there are no black people here, I just thought it was normal, but listening to this, I think we're wrong, I think my parents are wrong, I think this whole town is wrong, and half the audience starts booing her, their own neighbor, their own daughter and sister and niece, because she broke the code. She said the quiet part loud. She admitted that Forsyth County's all-white demographics aren't an accident or a preference but a sustained act of exclusion, and they hate her for it more than they hate Oprah because Oprah is an outsider but this girl is one of them and she's supposed to know better. Oprah looks at this young woman, who's now crying, whether from fear or relief or the weight of finally saying what she's thought for years, and says, "Thank you for your courage," and it's such a small moment but it matters because it shows that change is possible, that even in a town as resistant and hostile as Forsyth County, there are people who can hear truth and recognize it, who can break from their raising and choose something different. And maybe that's the point of all of this, not to change the 60-year-old man who says he'll never live next to a black person but to reach the 20-year-old woman who's just starting to question everything she was taught. The show ends, and Oprah stands up, and the audience doesn't applaud. How could they, after what just happened? But they don't boo either, they just sit there in stunned silence, and she walks off the stage knowing that she just did something. The episode airs a week later and becomes the most watched episode of the Oprah Winfrey Show up to that point, and the reaction is explosive. Some people praise her courage, some accuse her of stirring up trouble, some say she made things worse by bringing cameras to a quiet town. But everyone is talking about it because you can't watch that episode and pretend racism is just a Southern problem or a historical artifact or something that only exists in the hearts of extremists wearing white hoods. Forsyth County's residents appear on other shows defending themselves, insisting Oprah edited the footage to make them look bad, claiming they were taken out of context, but the footage speaks for itself. There's no editing that can soften, "I don't want N-words living next to me," no context that makes, "we just want to be with our own kind," sound reasonable, no spin that can explain away 75 years of intentional, violent exclusion. What Oprah did that day wasn't journalism in the traditional sense. She didn't claim objectivity, didn't pretend to be neutral, didn't give both sides equal weight as if there's a valid side to ethnic cleansing. She walked in as a black woman with a microphone and a camera and said, "Explain yourselves," and when they tried to hide behind euphemisms and coded language, she kept asking why until they either said the quiet part loud or tied themselves in logical knots trying to avoid it. After the show airs, Oprah receives death threats, letters telling her to stay out of white towns, calls promising violence if she ever comes back to Georgia, packages containing hate symbols and slurs. But she also receives thousands of letters from black Americans thanking her for doing what nobody else would do, for walking into that room and refusing to flinch, for showing white America what black Americans already knew. That places like Forsyth County exist all over the country, that sundown towns didn't end in 1912 or 1965 or any other convenient date that would let America move on, that the absence of black people in certain neighborhoods and schools and towns isn't an accident but a choice, and that choice is reinforced every single day by people who think they're good and decent and not racist because they don't use slurs or burn crosses but who also would never, ever sell their house to a black family or vote for integrated schools or question why their entire community looks like a 1950s Leave It to Beaver episode. In the years after the Forsyth County episode, Oprah builds her empire, a media mogul, a billionaire, the most influential woman in America, and people often point to that show as a turning point, the moment when she stopped being just a talk show host and became something bigger, a voice for uncomfortable truths, a person willing to walk into rooms where she wasn't wanted and ask questions nobody wanted to answer. Forsyth County itself changes slowly. By 2020, the black population is still only about 4%, but it's no longer zero, no longer a complete absence, and while that's not justice and not redemption and not nearly enough, it's at least an admission that the 75-year experiment in racial erasure couldn't last forever, that even the most resistant towns eventually have to confront what they've become. And Oprah? She never apologizes for that episode, never walks it back or softens it, and when people ask her years later if she was scared walking into Forsyth County, she says, "I wasn't scared, I was angry, and anger is more useful than fear because fear makes you small but anger makes you clear, and I was very, very clear about what I needed to do that day." January 1987. Oprah Winfrey walks into a town with no black people, sits down in front of 500 white residents who don't want her there, and asks one question, why? And for 2 hours, America watches as ordinary people try to explain the inexplicable, justify the unjustifiable, defend the indefensible. Some lie. Some deflect. Some just say the hate out loud. But one young woman, just one, says, "I think we're wrong." And maybe that's enough. Not to fix everything. Not to erase 75 years. But enough to prove that even in the hardest soil, truth can take root. Oprah walked into that room knowing she might not change anyone's mind, knowing she might face violence, knowing America might hate her for forcing them to look at what they'd rather ignore. But she walked in anyway. Because some stories need to be told even when, especially when, nobody wants to hear them. That's courage. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate your silence. Forsyth County wanted to stay invisible. Oprah made them visible. And television, and America, was never quite the same.